lecture in our video lecture series. Today we're going to be talking about aggregate supply and aggregate demand. These are very important macroeconomic concepts, really the ones that you are going to be using over and over and over again this semester. So really pay attention to this video lecture. Take excellent notes, detailed notes. If you have questions, write down those questions. Let's get right into it. Learning goals. What do we need to know by the end of this? By the end of this video lecture, you should be able to define aggregate demand and aggregate supply. We'll give you those definitions. You should also understand why the curves slope the way they do. Why are they shaped the way they are? And finally, you need to comprehend or understand what would cause either a shift in AD and AS. What would cause a shift in either AD or AS? So let's go ahead and get right into it. Aggregate demand. It's very similar to the concept of demand that we learned in microeconomics, except for when we think of aggregate demand, we're kind of thinking the word aggregate has to do with all of the sum of the parts added together. So if you took basically something and you aggregate it, it's like you're looking at it in its entirety. Think of it this way. It's basically sort of a generalized term for the demand of all goods and services in an economy. So we're kind of looking at the demand for everything, not just cars or houses, but everything. So we define it like this: the total value of goods and services that all buyers in an economy want to buy at different possible price levels. So it's very similar to demand, but just we're looking at all of the goods and services people want to buy at different price levels. So let's talk about who are those purchasers. So when we're looking at aggregate demand, we're looking at the demand for everything. Like we said, houses, cars, computers, pens, carpet, windows, everything that's produced. Kind of a demand curve for everything. So obviously one group that purchases a lot of different goods and services is consumers. Consumers are a major chunk of that demand curve. So consumers buy cars and houses and everything. So that's one group that is sort of, when we think of what consists of aggregate demand, or what is aggregate demand made up of? It's made up from the demand of consumers. It's also made up from the demand of businesses. If you think about it, businesses buy a lot of the same things consumers do. Businesses buy things like computers or desks or carpet or cars. Businesses buy a lot of similar things. I mean, go into any office building, you're going to see things that you will also see in homes. A lot of businesses have refrigerators in them so employees can store their drinks. They've got a variety of different products in there. And businesses buy different goods and services to make their own goods and services. These are called capital goods. So that it's not to say that businesses buy all of the same things that consumers do. Sometimes they're different. Like, garbage trucks and hydraulic presses are things that consumers generally don't buy, but businesses do. So it's not all the same, but that's part of aggregate demand. Next, the government. If you walk into any government building, you will see a lot of the same things we were just talking about. Whether that's carpet, pens, pencils, computers, desks, chairs, cars. The government owns a lot of cars. The government owns cement trucks. The government owns a lot of different things. So, you look at these are the three main entities, groups, buyers, purchasers in an economy. They are buying all of these different goods and services. So these are the main three things that make up aggregate demand domestically. However, we also have to take into account foreign markets. If you think about it, here in Germany, we produce cars. Consumers buy cars, businesses buy cars, the government buys cars. However, in addition to those domestic entities, also there are other consumers and governments from other countries, businesses from other countries, that also buy our cars. So the demand for exports is also taken into account. So if you add up all of these things, you would basically get the aggregate demand. Please also note that we also look at imports as well. And While, you'll notice that all of these things, this all represents spending, and exports represents spending on our goods just from other people in other countries. Imports is also spending on goods, but it's when we spend money and it flows to another country. So when we calculate aggregate demand, we basically say we add these things together: consumption, investment from businesses, government spending, exports, but we subtract the value of the imports. So it's just something to note. Next, when we make an aggregate demand line or slope or curve, the thing is, it's very similar to the demand curve. It looks just like it. We're going to label it slightly differently. Instead of D, we're going to call it AD. And the diagram we put it on is not going to be exactly the same. It's not going to be your typical, microeconomics diagram with price and quantity. It's instead going to have real GDP and on the x-axis, and then average price level or price level on the y-axis. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in the next slide. Much in the same way that aggregate demand, that regular demand, microeconomics demand, is downward sloping, showing an inverse relationship between price and quantity, aggregate demand is the same way. So let's go ahead and take a look and see what it looks like. Here again, we've got your typical macroeconomic diagram. This is average price level over here, sometimes just called price level. And this is GDP. This could also be called output. It could be called national income, or it could be called real GDP. A lot of different things. And then we have our aggregate demand curve. Why don't you draw one? Go ahead and pause the video and make one of these yourself. Okay, done drawing it? Great. So anyway, one other thing to note, average price level kind of has to do with the prices for all goods and services in an economy. Sometimes we have another concept that's related to this called inflation. And it has to do with if prices are rising, and that's something we'll talk about later. But just note that average price level is sort of the price of all goods and services in an economy. Aggregate demand is the demand for all goods and services in an economy, and GDP or output is the quantity of goods and services. So let's talk about, why does this curve slope the way it does? Why does it look like this? And again, this is thank you to economicsonline.co.uk for this diagram. I borrowed it from them, but I am citing them. First is the wealth effect. If price levels are high, if everything costs a lot of money in an economy, the value of wealth falls. People don't feel like they can spend as much and get as much. So for example, if prices were up here, and you can see that price of all goods and services is relatively high, the quantity of output would be, the real GDP, or the national income would be low. People are not spending as much or demanding as much goods and services at a high price. And that is because they don't feel as wealthy. Your wealth, if you feel wealthy, if you feel that your money goes a long way, you're probably more likely to spend it. So just note that here we've got a lower value here. If the average price level was lower, people would probably want to consume more goods and services. Next is something called the interest rate effect. Now we're going to talk a lot about interest rates in the future, but please, just to sort of a basic way to understand interest rates is, it is a fee for borrowing. If you go into a bank and you want to make a loan, you borrow money from the bank, but you also have to pay a rate of return for the bank. So you have to give them extra money, and that extra money is called interest. And so interest rate is just the percentage that you pay back to the bank. We're not going to get into this too deeply right now, but interest rates, generally, if prices are high, interest rates will also be high, and we'll explain this more later. But just note this, that if interest rates are high, That means if you want to take out a loan, that loan is much more expensive. Whereas if interest rates are low, the loan doesn't cost you very much. To give you an example, like let's say you were going to borrow 100 euros from a bank. 100 euros, and let's say interest rates are really, really low. Let's say they're 1% a year. So if you want to borrow 100 euros from the bank, and they're only going to charge you €1 to borrow that money for a year, it's very low. You're probably thinking, wow, that's not much of a charge at all. Why don't I borrow that money? So if interest rates are low, generally price levels have a connection with interest rates. So if prices are low, like here, the quantity of goods and services people want to spend would be higher. However, if prices are high, interest rates tend to also be higher, and that would mean less spending. Again, don't worry about this too much. It's kind of complicated, and we're going to talk about it more in later lessons. Finally, the international trade effect. If you think about it, this is representing the price of our goods and services. If our goods and services are expensive, if they have a high price level, we're not going to sell as many of them. The output we're going to sell abroad is not going to be as high, because if our goods are expensive, maybe they're going, people that from overseas or abroad that normally buy our goods and services will buy less. So they'll, at a higher prices or a higher price level, generally we sell less exports. Also, domestically, if everything in our country costs a lot of money, if this is the prices up here, and if on the average price level, we're also, as domestic consumers, not going to be consuming as much real GDP or as much output, because we can buy, other goods from abroad that are cheaper. So this is also known as the international trade effect. So I would like you to write these down. If you have questions, write down your questions too. And please note that these three things help to explain why the AD curve is shaped the way it is. Okay, so there are three things that shift the AD, or sorry, not three, but four technically, four things that shift the AD curve. One of them is consumption. If consumption increases, then AD will increase, or it will shift to the right. And there are things that impact consumption. So I want to talk to you about those things that impact consumption. One of them is consumer wealth and income. So if consumers, like for example, if the value of homes in a country goes up, or the value of their consumer assets, homes, stocks, whatever, property increases, or if those consumers in that country are, having a greater level of income. If income is rising in a country, consumers will spend more. Also, there's something called consumer confidence and consumer expectations. Generally, if consumers are confident about the economy, if they think the economy is going to do well, then they are going to spend money. However, if people think, oh no, the economy is going to go, into the toilet, it's going to do terrible, we shouldn't spend money. Usually, if, for example, if you have high unemployment in the country, people they don't have a lot of confidence. They're worried about losing their jobs. They don't want to spend money. They want to save money. So they're not going to increase their consumption. So again, if consumers are making more money, they'll spend more. So if incomes are higher, they'll spend more. If they're confident about the economy and are confident about their job and that they're going to keep it, they'll also spend money. Interest rates, as we said earlier, they are the fee for borrowing, and another way we can also define it is the reward for saving. If you go into any bank and open up a savings account, there is an interest rate. So the savings, if you have a savings account, go talk to your bank and they'll tell you that they'll give you so much percentage every year for saving in their bank. Well, if the percentage is very, very low, you don't want to save. You'd rather spend. However, if you have a really high interest rate, you would rather save. So just note that that interest rate can affect whether you would want to save your money or spend your money. It also impacts, lending and borrowing as well. Right? If loans are cheap, for example, I guess we're going to talk about this more in detail. If interest rates are low, that means to borrow money is very, very inexpensive. So if interest rates are low, like we said in the previous example, maybe 1% or 2%, if you wanted to buy a house or a car, the fee for borrowing a bunch of money to buy a house or car is very low. So you would want to borrow that money and buy that item. We'll talk more about that in the future. Next, income taxes. All consumers, in almost not every country in the world, but many countries have income taxes. And you pay this every paycheck you get to the government. And sometimes you have to even pay more at certain parts of the year. So income taxes, they generally, if we reduce them, people will consume more goods and services. If we raise them, they'll consume less, because it has a direct impact on their income or disposable income. Next, household indebtedness, and this kind of relates to confidence. It's the level of debt that each household has. In a country like Germany, household indebtedness is low. Generally, people do not have a lot of debt in Germany, whereas if you compare it to the United States, the level of household debt is very, very high. The average American, I think, has something like $10,000 in credit card debt. It's very, very high. And so when people have a lot of debt, they're less likely to consume. Also, I guess there's something to be said for what's called the cultural attitude towards spending. And those do change with countries over time, depending on what stage of development they're in. And so that's something to note too. It's also something we'll get more into as we get into other branches of economics, like developmental economics, but just note that attitude towards spending also plays a role. Okay, next, investment. Investment is defined as spending on capital goods. Again, investment is defined as spending on capital goods, and usually by firms or the government. But we'll say just for firms for now. We're going to be thinking about businesses. Businesses are also impacted by interest rates. If interest rates are low, that means when a business wants to take out a loan, it's very cheap for them as well. They're also not incentivized to save their profits. They're incentivized to invest their profits. So they're going to buy more capital goods, whether that's robots for their factory or computers or printers or whatever it is. They will purchase more goods and services at lower interest rates because they will take out loans for investment purposes. Next, something called business confidence, which is similar to consumer confidence or expected returns. If businesses are confident the economy as a whole is going to do well, they're more likely to invest and spend because they will expect higher returns or, basically profit in the future. So again, if the economy is doing well, businesses are confident, they will invest and will buy more capital goods. However, if they don't think so, if business confidence is low, they might not invest as much. So less spending on capital goods, lower investment, and that could also shift the demand curve. Changes in business taxes or corporate taxes. Every country in the world, businesses have to pay per certain percentage of their profits to the government. Now, this is kind of tricky, but just note that if a government says, kind of like Donald Trump has said in the United States, that he's going to lower taxes on businesses, businesses thinking that they're going, I don't know if this is going to happen or not, but I'm not necessarily saying it's good or bad. I don't want to put an opinion out there for you to believe in, but just note that business taxes can impact investment. If people that own businesses or invest in businesses think that those taxes will drop, they're more likely to invest in that country or in the companies within that country because they think the profitability of those companies will rise. And finally, legal issues or institutional changes. So those also impact investment, and these are tricky, but maybe the United States is also another good example. Every government has regulations, and legal institutions that regulate investment and regulate how business is done. If it's very, very difficult, for example, to open up a business, if there's a lot of red tape, if there's a lot of bureaucracy, then it does not inspire a lot of investment from investors. However, if, for example, there was a change where it was easier to invest, you might have more investment. Finally, technology also can inspire investment or encourage investment. As it improves, different groups of people that invest will free up that money to invest in new technology as they see the potential for profitability. All right, next, government spending. Just note that government spending sort of consists of two parts: government spending and taxation. So if the government increases its spending, they're going to buy more goods and services. Or they could also decrease their spending. Governments can also set taxes. They can increase taxes or decrease taxes. This can also affect aggregate demand. And finally, net exports. This is the last thing that impacts aggregate demand. So net exports is basically exports minus imports. This is also influenced by exchange rates. So just note that if we sell more exports, then AD will rise. If we sell less exports, AD will fall. If we buy more imports, AD will fall. If we buy fewer imports, AD may rise. This is really impacted a lot by exchange rates. And just note that if we have, for example, a low exchange rate, that means that our goods and services are relatively cheap. Whereas if the euro was really, really strong, we wouldn't sell as much. So it could cause AD to shift back to the left. Don't worry about exchange rates too much. This is more, we'll learn more about this on international economics next year. But just note that exchange rates do impact the level aggregate demand. So we're going to just go ahead and skip to determinants of AD, what can cause it to shift. As we said earlier, it is consumption, investment, government spending, and or net exports. If anything causes any of these three to rise or exports to rise, then AD will shift to the right. If consumption falls or investment falls or government spending falls, AD will shift to the left. So again, we'll give you a couple of examples from the previous things we've gone over. For consumption, one of the things that in fact impacts consumption is consumer confidence. If consumers are confident about the economy, AD could shift to the right. Also, we said if interest rates were low, right, AD would shift to the right. Because consumers would want to buy more goods and services, and businesses would want to buy more goods and services. There would be a higher level of investment. Another one, how about the wealth effect? Or, if consumers feel wealthier or if the value of their assets are rising, aggregate demand would rise. If income of consumers rises, aggregate demand rises. There's a whole bunch of different things. If government spending rises, AD rises. If government reduces taxes on personal income taxes, AD would go to the right. So everything that we've just gone over could shift AD to the right or to the left. We're going to be practicing this in class. All right, so we'll stop there. Thank you for listening, and the next lecture will be on aggregate supply.